Hi, what's the problem with stances in Tekken? What's the problem with stances in Tekken? That's the question that I think we need to be asking and answering for ourselves. A lot of people might respond to this with the 50-50 and aggression and pressure and things like that. But the problem with these answers is that this is a very broad statement for a more narrow problem. If the problem, the true problem with stances was that they were too aggressive, or people don't like aggression, or people don't like 50-50s, then we wouldn't have games like Virtua Fighter, Soul Calibur, anime fighting games, in fact, and the most popular fighting game on the planet would be Samurai Showdown. So the problem isn't that stances cause 50-50s. The problem isn't aggression. The problem aren't these things that Tekken players are citing. The problem is how the stances are designed. And another problem, and the reason why so many people are talking about this and saying stances are bad without giving any particular reasons as to why it's bad or any potential changes to it, is because Tekken players don't have the perspective of what good game design looks like. And I don't mean that in a Tekken bad way sort of thing. I mean that very objectively. The way that Tekken 8 is designed and the way that the stances are designed are horrid. As much as it seemed like that I'm more optimistic about Season 2, the way that the game works as it is now is terrible. And if you ever watch me stream, you will hear me say that this game sucks. It's terrible. I hate it. And it's because the game design is bad. But the reason why I'm more optimistic is because I have the perspective of what good game design looks like and what good stance design looks like. And those principles are what I see in the Tekken Talk for Season 2 and some of the Season 2 stuff. And while, of course, there are bad things there, don't get me wrong, from what I've seen based on my experience playing other fighting games, particularly Soul Calibur, where these things are well designed, I'm seeing a lot of those principles in what I'm seeing from the Tekken Talk, from the previews, and that's what's making me optimistic. So what I want to do in this video is talk more specifically about what's bad with stances in Tekken, what the problems are in Tekken. I want to give you that perspective so that we have an understanding of what the actual issues are that need to be fixed, instead of just saying stance is bad, but not being able to actually articulate what's bad about them, why they're bad, and how we fix them. I also wanted to show you some examples of how this can be good design in Soul Calibur, because Soul Calibur stances are very well designed, just to give you an idea of what it could look like if these issues are fixed, and why we can be excited for stances and reworks and redesigns so long as they're done right. I want to show you how stances can not only add to player expression and creativity, but actively enhance the enjoyment of the game, instead of just adding to this mindless aggression and pressure that so many of you, when you see stances, immediately think of. And then I want to circle us back in the end, back to Tekken 8, and show you some examples of actual good stance design, compare those to the bad ones that we've seen before, so that we can clearly see the distinction between the two. And then hopefully, by the end of this, you'll have a better understanding of what good stance design looks like, what bad stance design looks like, and maybe why I'm a little bit more optimistic on what they're going to change here going into Season 2. So before we even get into the game, I want to talk about the 5 main problems that Tekken 8 has in regards to its stances. The first one, of course, is that there's no real risk to the attacker when you're doing these stances and stance mix-ups. A lot of stances in this game, you have a mid, which is going to net you big reward. It's very little risk to you, and then you have a low that, when it's blocked, also isn't putting a lot of risk to you and is doing enough that's forcing the opponent to have to crouch or have to respond to the stance, which is just making your safe mid even stronger. the risk reward in stances in this game for the vast majority of cases is heavily skewed to the attacker. The other problem is that entering stances don't require a lot of thought or risk to the attacker. For example, if Xiao Yu does forward 2-1 and goes into hypnosis stance, that is something that she can hit confirm, she can do for free. The forward 2-1 isn't unsafe, and there's nothing that the opponent can do to actually defend against the hypnosis stance. And that leads to point number 3. There's no way in some cases for the defender to properly defend against these stances. A lot of the time, whether it's through heat smash or some move on hit or whatever, the defender has no choices, even if they have the right read on what the opponent's going to do to be able to defend. This leads to a more exacerbated problem of there being no risk to the attacker, because while there already isn't a risk to the attacker, the defender has no recourse to being able to, even if they have the right read, properly react and respond to what the opponent is doing. This causes a major issue where if the defender can't do anything and the attacker can just get away with the mix-ups for free, not only your mix-ups are really strong, but because it's so mindless, you can just loop into it again and again and again, and the defender doesn't really have any choices, and even if they do have a choice, it's leaving them at very high risk and for very little reward. This is also a problem because there are just no defensive mechanics anywhere in Tekken 8. Tekken 8 is a game that is extremely aggressive and has a lot of these offensive tools, and it really makes sense for the game to have some sort of defensive mechanic, but it doesn't. The closest that Tekken 8 has to a defensive mechanic is Power Crush, but the problem with Power Crush is similar to what we talked about just a little bit earlier, where Power Crush nets you very little reward, but puts you at a lot of risk. The exceptions to that are, of course, high Power Crushes and Heat Engager Power Crushes, but because Heat Engager Power Crushes are being done away with, and it feels like there's no real reason for why certain moves are high Power Crushes, some are mid, like there's no character-specific reason for them. It's not determinative based on the character strengths or weaknesses, it's just given to them randomly, at least that's what it feels to me. It means that the real defensive mechanics in this game to avoid these situations are realistically non-existent, and that just makes the attacker even more powerful than the defender. When we think about stances as well, this just further exacerbates the other 2 points of the attacker putting themselves at very little risk and the defender having to take too much of a risk to be able to defend against the stance mix-up, if they even have the choice to defend against it in the first place. The fourth problem is that stances aren't unique. What stances do, what they should do, I should say, in a fighting game is add to play expression, add to the complexity and depth of the character, do something that is interesting and makes the character stand out. Stances shouldn't be something that you can just give to every single character and you can flip them between characters and no one would notice, but that's the case with most stances in this game. Look at Leroy's Hermit stance, for instance. Leroy's Hermit stance, yes, it has a couple of things that pertain to Leroy. It has the built-in Sabaki and it has the built-in low parry, but at the end of the day, all the stance is a mid and a low mix-up. That is what it comes down to. That's all it is. And you could give Hermit stance to any other character in the game, and if you didn't know it originally belonged to Leroy, then no one would really notice. And finally, because of all of these factors combined, the most important thing is that stances do not lead to any interaction. This is one of the biggest problems with Tekken 8 in general, but the fact that there's no interaction between the attacker and the defender in Tekken 8 is ultimately the biggest problem. The reason why there's very little interaction is because the attacker doesn't have to think and the defender can't really do anything. When it comes to stances in particular, instead of just talking about the scope overall of the game, this means that when you go into a stance, it becomes more of a single player game rather than a game where you and your opponent are going back and forth. stances, for the most part, should complement this interaction. Stances should be something that you have to work or earn to get to, and then there's still some sort of interaction there. It shouldn't just be you throw out a move for free, you go into a stance, you do the mix-up, you're able to continue your pressure, and you can do this no matter what the player's playing, like no matter what their play styles, no matter what their characters, and you can just go, 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 go. When you are playing a character with a stance mix-up, and you're playing against the opponent, and you go into the stance, are you ever really thinking about what that player's play style is, what character they're playing, how they're interacting with you? Chances are, unless you're playing 2 or 3 specific characters in Tekken 8, you're not. And that is the crux of the problem with stances in Tekken 8. They ultimately lead to no interaction. And when you have no interaction, then all the game and the characters devolve into is a coin flip. Except the coin flip is more skewed in favor of the attacker. It's not a true 50-50 because the defender doesn't have any options to block if they think it's tails and it flips to tails. And then, even if they do get the read and block it, then the attacker is allowed to flip the coin and again, and potentially again, and again, and again. So, this whole dynamic is what makes the game, and the stances in particular, badly designed. It's not just the case of a character having a stance being bad, it's all of these factors that combine into one that causes this perception of aggression being bad, of stances being bad, of 50-50s being bad, because it's not necessarily that those things are true in a vacuum, but the way that they are designed and implemented in Tekken 8 is the problem. So now let's take a look at some examples of good game design and good stance design going over some of these things that we just talked about. So here we have Hwang, and one of the things that we talked about is the 50-50 just being too powerful and too skewed towards the attacker, right? So Hwang has 4 stances here. He has this stance, he has this stance, he has this stance, and he has this stance. And there is only one stance here that actually has a mix-up. It's this one. So the thing with Hwang is that not all of these stances are necessarily used for mix-ups in the traditional stance of mid or low, right? There's other nuance to it. So for example, if I do 6A plus B here, a normal hit, B is guaranteed. But that means if it's blocked, then the opponent can sidestep this vertical attack. And so even though I don't actually have a mix-up from this stance, that's specifically when they have full meter, so don't worry about that launcher. Basically, the mix-up here is that if this is blocked, the opponent can assume, oh, they're going to do the vertical sidestep and then launch you. If Hwang thinks that you're going to sidestep there after this is blocked, then he can do the horizontal to catch the opponent sidestepping. Now, this doesn't do anything really on if the opponent sidesteps, but it is the option to catch sidestep, right? So the point of this stance isn't just I go into the thing, I get guaranteed follow-up if it hits, and if it's blocked, I get mix-up. Which is what it would normally be in Tekken 8, right? No, in this case, the reason why the stance works here and why the moves work here is so that Hwang has the ability to stop the opponent from launching them. But because there's no mix-up in the stance, the opponent, the defender, doesn't have to interact with this if they don't want to take the risk. That is the reward they get for blocking this instead of them being punished for blocking this hit that has the guaranteed follow-up. On top of that, Hwang's other moves that go into stance carry risks with them, right? So normally in Tekken, we'd be looking at someone like Xiao Yu, again, doing 4-2-1 and then going in hypnosis, being able to hit confirm it, right? Most characters, if they go in the stance, they can confirm it, go in the stance when they know they're going to get a hit, don't really have to take a ton of risk to get in there. But in Hwang's case, to get into some of his stances, he needs to do like 6BA. Right? He does this, goes into here, and this is going to give him his stance. But the problem when he does this is that the second hit you can see is a high, right? So if the opponent ducks this, then it just stops him from being able to go into his stance. He gets launched, and because of that, he has to take a risk, right? So again, this is a case of the attacker not just being able to get these 50-50s for free, not being able to go into stance and force the mix-up for free. He has to take some risk here. And Hwang has a way to mitigate. If the opponent ducks the high, he can cancel this. But if the opponent gets to re on the cancel, then they can launch him, right? So that's sort of the dynamic going on here. But if he does get this hit, let's say he does this, and then he goes into it, then he goes into stance and he's able to get the mix-up, right? And even when it comes to the mix-up, again, the attacker, well, this goes into point number 2 of the defender not having options to deal with the stance mix-up. Because normally in Tekken 8, you do this and you hit them. If the opponent does the mid or the attacker does the mid, the defender wouldn't be able to really defend against it. But in Hwang's case, he has the low, which you can obviously block and doesn't do a ton of damage. And then, he has the mid here, which if the mid hits, gotta actually have this be in range to hit. If the mid hits, let's do it this way, then it leaves Hwang at plus 16 and gives him a combo, but the opponent can still sidestep it, right? So the defender obviously has to make a choice here. That's Hwang's reward for hitting this move, which carries risk with it. He gets to go into the stance and do this mix-up. But the opponent is able to defend against both options properly. Now, the way that this becomes unique with Hwang is that Hwang actually can use the low here as a launcher. The way that he does this is you see that resource right below his name. When he goes into these stances, it costs a resource. He has ways to be able to get these resources back, and when he does certain moves, it costs him this resource. When he gets down to -9, this low becomes a combo. It does 60 damage. He gets this once per game. He cannot do this again, even though he's still at -9. This is once per game. And when this resource is at -9, if you go into the next round, so if this isn't the final round of the game, or Hwang doesn't win on this round, at round start, Hwang will lose half of his health. So even though we look at this and we think, oh, this is really good, because even though we do this, we can go into here, right? And we're getting 60 damage off of whatever launcher. We can get Oki off of that too. The real truth of it is that Hwang can only do this once per game, and if he doesn't win the match on that game, then he loses half of his health and he basically loses the entire game. So even with stuff like this, he's taking a risk that transcends just the situation in the round, but encompasses the entire game. So this is one aspect of good stance design and game design, where you're not skewing all aspects of the attack and the aggression towards the aggressor. You're not giving them all of the advantage. The defender still has options they can do. They still have things that they can choose from. No matter how advantageous the situation is for the attacker in Hwang's case, the defender is always going to have options to be able to mitigate the damage that they're taking. When the opponent goes in the stance at times, the defender doesn't necessarily have to respond to it. And the way these tools are designed around interaction and utilizing Hwang's unique strengths. For example, when he's here as well, Hwang now has access to a grab off of this, so he can choose to either do this in the stance, or he can choose to do this, and then he gets this, which leads to combo. It's not the full combo, but you get the idea. But again, that is once per game, and he has to be at -6 of that thing over there, and if he's at -6 in the next round, he will lose a quarter of his health at round start. So that's part of like the dynamic of these stances and how this works, where when Hwang gets to a certain point in the game, these moves that he's doing carry a little bit more reward for him, so the opponent has to respond more as the game progresses, depending on the situation. But again, that just promotes the interaction between the two players with this character. But it's not just about the interaction between the attacker and defender that's important. It also matters on the mechanics as well. So here we have a character you're a little bit more familiar with, Yoshimitsu. And Yoshimitsu's Dragonfly stance is a little bit different in this game. And the reason why is because, one, he doesn't have a mid-heat engager from here, but what he has is his forward 1+2 is his A here, and this is a mid, but it's -12 on block. So this is his mid. He has another mid here that gives him a guaranteed follow-up, but is steppable. And then he has a low that doesn't really do a whole lot and is, of course, punishable on block. Now, one of the things with Yoshimitsu is that he has frame traps similar to what they are in Tekken. He can do 6A plus B, which puts him in the flea, and then this into 6A, which is his forward 1 in Tekken. This is probably something you're going to be seeing in Season 2, puts him in Dragonfly, and then he can do Dragonfly A. The thing is, if the opponent defends against all of this, then Yoshimitsu is left punishable. In Tekken, if he does the same sequence, he's left at -2 or plus if he is in heat. So again, the defender doesn't have a lot of options to deal with this. In Soul Calibur, if the defender chooses to just block, then the only thing that they're really putting themselves at risk for is something like this, or we can do a similar thing like this and then do the low, right? But that's not going to be too bad. And if the opponent ducks, yes, Yoshi's going to get a bit of reward off of this, but he's not going to be able to get something big like a heat engager or something. The other thing with this, though, about this whole dynamic is that there are multiple points where you can kind of safely just avoid what Yoshimitsu is doing here. In Tekken, if the opponent ducks in Dragonfly, then Yoshimitsu is able to get a mid-heat engage that's -4 on block, again, limiting the defender's options. But with Soul Calibur here, you could duck under this attack, right? And then you go in the Dragonfly, and then you can option select between the mid and the low. How do you do that? Well, it's very simple. The way that you do it is with Soul Calibur's universal parry system called God Impact. So I have the opponent now set to God Impact at the right timing, hopefully. So I'm going to have the opponent, I'm going to try this again, go here, do this, and then God Impact. So that beats the mid, that parries the mid. And then we do this, low, that parries the low. So not only do we have all of these points where we can stop the attack, and we have more opportunities for the defender to get rewarded for just blocking, right? Because we don't have like these -4 heat engages or these highs that lead in the frame traps. But then on top of that, if we have the read with the timing that the Yoshimitsu player is going to do this mix-up, then we have a mechanic to be able to deal with the timing aspect of it as well. So not only can we deal with the mid and the low simultaneously, but then if we want to deal with them individually as well, we can. And so this incorporates another element of the mix-up, which is timing, where we can delay this and then punish the opponent if they do a God Impact. But of course, if we delay that and don't immediately attack, then the opponent can retaliate as well. And again, this goes back to the core point of promoting interaction. Not only does the defender have more options, if they know what the timing is, but doesn't necessarily know what it's going to be the mid or the low, they have God Impact. If they don't know what the timing is, but they know it's going to be the mid and not the low, they can block. If they know that the Yoshimitsu is going to do the vertical, they can sidestep, right? So every single aspect of this, the defender has an option to be able to deal with it. This is what good game design and good stance design looks like, and is something that is missing very painfully from Tekken 8. And this is something that people complain about a lot. But this is an example of where it actually works. This is an example, looking at it, that you should be looking for in Season 2 that is good game design and good stance design, and something that we need more of. And this is why I advocate that one of the things we need more than anything else in Tekken 8 is some sort of universal defensive mechanic that promotes interaction. Now, another thing I want to talk about with stances is just the uniqueness that can come from stances, how much they can contribute to player expression and creativity when designing a character. I have Setsuka here because Setsuka and Anna have the same voice actor, so I think it's apt, but Setsuka is also a great example of this. You can see that she has a little mechanic up there. She has a couple of flowers and a moon, and these will change various moves of hers as they progress through the game. You get one for counter hits, you get one for hitting the opponent, and you get one for punishing. Sorry, I forgot what the L one was for a second. And that's how you build up these meters. And so certain moves that Setsuka has, like for example 4/4 B plus K, which is her 12 frame punish, will get enhanced when she builds up this meter. So that's what a 12 frame punish looks like normally, and you can see how we built up one of our flowers there. But when we have these full, how do I do this again? There we go. When we have these full, you can see how this move actually gets enhanced, so it has more range, it does more damage, it knocks down. And this also extends to Setsuka's stances. So she has what I like to call Mary Poppins stance. And Mary's Poppins stance here is more of a Tekken-esque stance, where it has a mid here and a low. But as you can see, these aren't doing a whole lot. Now, the low does knock down on normal hit, yes. But by themselves, these aren't doing a whole lot because the stance is slow. You don't have a lot of ways to be able to go into it. And you can see that the mid isn't exactly doing a whole lot, right? We have some odd things that we can do as well. So we can choose to do nothing in the stance and then go in the back turn and then get something like this, if I could remember what the actual input is. So we could do something like this, go in the back turn, bop, bop, and then do that, right? So that's gonna give us 52 damage. It's probably execution heavy as well to do that, but that's part of like the player expression that comes from the stance. Because you go into the Mary Poppins stance, you risk the mid or the low. If they attack into it, then you get counter hit, and that adds to something. You can go in the back turn off that, back turn mix up, and then if you have the execution for it, sorry, this is a little bit difficult to do. I haven't done it in a very long time, but then you're able to get the combo off of the mid. Just one example of this, right? So this is adding, even though it's just the typical like stance 50-50, because of the dynamic on how this works, and because Setsuka again has to take a risk to go into here because of how slow it is, it adds to that that player expression and the creativity behind the character. But it's not just something that ends there, right? Because we have these options that are slow. We can also choose to go into the stance and then just do this or this, which doesn't actually have a proper low out of it. And if we have all of our state enhanced, I can't remember which flower it is that gives you this. One gives you one of them and one gives you the other, the blue and the red one. But now our moves from the stance are enhanced. So if we do now this, then we get a combo off of it for 50 damage off of this low. And now if we do the mid, we also get something off of the mid as well. So it's just enhancing the moves that we can do. I don't actually remember how this works, to be honest with you. There you go. That's what you do. So that's sort of what's happening. And it's not like the mid is giving you a whole hell of a lot more than it was before. It's more the low that's doing it. It also becomes a plus on block low. But this is adding to that dynamic, right? Because this is something you have to work towards for the entire game. And the way that you build up these meters is, again, through counter hit and punishment, right? So those are things that rely on the opponent to do something. Whereas you look at these kind of states or these gimmicks in Tekken 8, and they rely wholly on the character you're playing, on the attacker, to do something in order to get into them. You look at Lydia, you look at Heihachi, you look at Eddie. All of these characters, to build up these states, only require you to do something. In Setsuka's case, to unlock these enhanced moves, it requires the opponent to do something that's punishable. If the opponent never does anything that's punishable throughout the game, then you are never going to be able to build the flower that allows you to do this, right? So that's part of what adds to this interaction between you and the opponent. Just having these gimmicks is going to, from the very beginning, change how you have to approach the character in the situation, which is interesting. It's creative, it's different, and it makes the characters not all feel the same. But on top of that, it also adds more things for Setsuka to do, baiting the opponent into doing something punishable so that you can punish them and build up your flowers, changing the dynamic of how the stances work, changing how you can threaten with the stance, how you can threaten with the back turn mix-up, and various aspects like that just promote not only play expression and creativity, but also the interaction between you and your opponent. Both of these things are something that's missing in Tekken 8, and even with a stance like this that is a very Tekken 8-like stance, you can see just how more interesting this sort of dynamic can be with the right systems in place and the right way that you approach the stance 50-50 mix-up. This is just one example, but I think it's a very strong example of how it's not necessarily like the stances in Tekken 8 that are flawed, but it's the design, it's the lack of creativity, and it's how homogenized everything is in the game when it doesn't have to be. And so finally, this leads me to my last point, which is interaction. Including all of these things all summed up into one package, into one character. And the way that we talk about that with Talim is that Talim has 4 stances. She has Wind Charmer, she has Wind Soul, she has Wind Fury, and she has Back Turn. So all 4 of these stances include some pretty big mix-ups. She has Back Turn B, for instance, which leads to full combo here and puts her back in the back turn so that she can do another mix-up from back turn. In Wind Charmer, she has stuff like Unbreakable Throw, which leads to a mix-up, which leads to back turn, which leads to which can lead to a throw or the mid, and the throw has options out of it as well. But then if she goes in the Wind Charmer, she can do this A, and so both these are high, so the opponent can start ducking. But then she has the B, and she has a B on the launcher, which again leads her in the back turn, which does this and this and this and blah 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 blah. And then she can do like this low from back turn, or she can go into Wind Soul, and then from Wind Soul she can go into Wind Charmer, etc., etc. So the thing about how Talim's stances work is that while this is very overloading, if you don't know the characters, it's so many options, and we're not talking about necessarily all of them, you can see how the way that things flow into each other creates a unique and interesting dynamic with the character. You have a lot of options to choose from all of your stances. You have a lot of things that you can do. You're thinking multiple steps ahead on how one stance is going to lead to another stance and how that stance is going to lead into another stance. But also you have to consider risk reward. Because when you're in these stances, like we talked about before, this is a high, right? So if the opponent ducks it, you get launched. What you can do to prevent that is do BB. But this is minus 14 on block. So if you know that the opponent's going to crouch, then you can do this. And this is a full launcher that leads to an Oki setup. But if they block the first hit, they can sidestep the second hit. So that's what you have the minus 14 move for. So either way, when you do a mid, you're taking a risk. And then if the opponent, when you go into stance, chooses to hit a button, you have your fast, safe mid, but it's not going to be doing as much as those other moves do. You also, again, have the command grab, but this is a high just like the A and just putting you at risk. You're getting 42 damage, the opponent can launch you, right? And then you also have a low here, but this is very slow and specifically made for beating GIs. This launches the opponent if they got impact, if they do the universal parry. So this is a similar dynamic to, say, Lydia, where you have a lot of these options that can overwhelm the opponent, but you have to be really mindful of what options you're choosing to use, because if you get too obvious about them, the opponent can counter it very easily. There's also something that you might have noticed if you were paying attention with the Yoshimitsu example, where it's about timing, right? So if I do something to go into the stance and I do the A, I do the B, I do the grab, all of these things can be God impacted. They can be parried. So the opponent doesn't necessarily even have to guess between the high and the mid. They don't have to guess between the grab and the mid, because the universal mechanics exist. And the universal mechanic is what really brings this together. If there was no God impact, then yes, this would be way too strong. And so if you're only a Tekken player, you might be looking at this and thinking, oh, it's just another stupid 50-50 mix-up and he's going on trying to justify it. But no. Because if the opponent does the universal defensive mechanic, then all of a sudden the aggressor's on the back foot, so they have to be smart about it. And that's why there's this big reactable low that is putting you at risk, but is specifically designed to beat that. That's the point. But if you get a real mastery of these systems, then you can do something like 6-6A to initiate, go into here, bop, bop. Or, so what you can do, for example, is initiate here, go here, boop, boop, get a launch, go in the back turn, do the follow-up, go here, do the mid because they're going to crouch, do this, keep going, boop, and we can do that sequence, which seems really oppressive, but Talim has to take multiple risks to do that, right? Again, you can duck this high, you can sidestep this mid both times, And the aggressor doesn't necessarily have to respond, right? They could just choose to block all of this, and then it's no big deal. So then the interaction becomes, if they're choosing to block all of this, right, you get some plus trains, but you're not so far back, you can't really just do an A again and start it all over again. So now the thing becomes, we can do this, we could do something like this. This mid is -12, by the way. The low is obviously launch punishable because it goes low-high. But then the opponent can also guard impact that, right? So now if they're guard impacting, if they're defending against that, we do this, and then we can do something like that to beat the guard impact, or we could do bop, 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 bop. We do this, we could go in the win zone, we actually get a low, but it's more telegraphed because of how slow it is, and we can get swatted out of it. So there are multiple points for the defender to be able to interact. Even though this seems like it's very oppressive, the defender has plenty of opportunities to be able to stop it, right? And so that is a big thing between a good and a bad Talim player, and why she has a pretty big skill floor is because being able to utilize all these moves and stances in tandem with each other, like we can do this into this into this or something like that, being able to utilize all of these things in tandem with one another is part of the creativity and play expression with Talim, and that's why she's one of the hardest characters in the game. But it's also not just in the stances, but it's also getting into the stances. One of the reasons why Talim is allowed to have all of this stuff is because she has to take a lot of risks at long range and when going into the stances in the first place. So if Talim's out at long range here, for example, the only moves that she has to be able to approach the opponent are this and this. Both of these moves are highs. So if you're out here and the opponent just crouches, then Talim doesn't have a mid to actually be able to stop this. So you have to be able to play really good neutral to be able to get in and start your offense. The other thing is that a lot of the things that put her in stance like this, for example, if she goes in the stance are punishable. Well, she doesn't go in the stance, it's punishable too, but you can knock her out of this. So Talim has to be really good at making sure she's properly hit confirming these things if she's gonna go in the stance, because otherwise she can just get knocked out stance. She's not plus. The mix-up isn't real. And again, that's different from how it is in, say, Tekken, where it's like, I can do this, go in the stance, and then I just get free stuff. Not the case necessarily in Soul Calibur. But then the things that she does that are plus in the stance have risks in themselves too. So one of the main moves you would do to go in the stance is A. But there are multiple points where this can be interrupted. So if I set the opponent here to block and then to guard impact, this, I don't know why they're not guard impacting this, but this can be guard impacted. The mid here can be guard impacted. It can be parried. So that's one thing that you have to consider. And the way that you get around this with Talim is if I set the bot here to guard impact and I do this, they guard impact. Okay, that was not what I wanted. So if I have the bot set to guard impact here and I do this and I know that they're going to guard impact, why are they not? This is so weird. This is so strange. Let's just do it like this. If I know that they're going to guard impact in between there, then I can actually do core circle forward B, because that move gives me a big combo when my opponent guard impacts. I don't know why it's bugged specifically for this move, but that's a lot of damage, right? So that's part of the idea here too, and that's more of like the interaction. And then with this last hit as well, this last hit can also be guard impacted. And it has a mid mix up, but the mid can also be guard impacted. So again, we don't have to guess between the mid or the high, because both can be guard impacted with the universal mechanics, right? So that's kind of what we're waiting for then here too, is the same thing kind of happens where the opponent doesn't have to choose to interact, right? Because there's no low mix-up. But if they do choose to interact, Talim can get a big reward out of it, but she has to take multiple risks. She has to choose to like not attack here, right? And then she also has to choose to just throw this move out, which is punishable, and the opponent can sidestep. So the attacker gets a lot of reward, but they have to take big risks. The defender has to take big risks too to get that reward, but they don't have to do it, right? And that's part of the interaction. And then if you get past all of those layers and you're able to do the AAGA, now we're able to actually enforce this mix-up if we want to. Now we're finally able to get into this, but you see all of the steps that we have to take to be able to get there. And that, again, is why Talim is one of the harder characters in the game. But it's also why Talim is one of the, probably the most fun fighting game character I've ever played in any fighting game, in my opinion. This is why she's my main. Is because everything that she has, everything that encompasses how like she functions, her stances, it promotes play expression, it promotes creativity, it promotes a strong understanding of the game, fundamentals, neutral, your stances, your mix-ups, your options, and most importantly, it promotes interaction. The reason why the stances and the mix-ups out of them are so fun and interesting is because it promotes interaction. And this is the thing that Tekken is missing, right? Ultimately, the problems in Tekken are that stances and just in general the game skew way too heavily towards the attacker. The defender doesn't have a lot of options to be able to properly defend against it. The aggressor has no reason to actually interact with the opponent, and it just contributes to this mindless 50-50 that homogenizes all the characters, because stances are supposed to make characters feel more unique. They're supposed to add to the play expression. They're supposed to add to creativity. And I hope my demonstrations here in Soul Calibur have shown you that. They've shown you what good game design is supposed to look like, what good character design is supposed to look like. And now that you've seen some examples from those, you can see very clearly how this is different from characters like Lily and Leroy and Xiaoyu and so many other characters in Tekken 8 that ultimately just evolve into either doing the mid or the low. And so to conclude this video, when I look at some of the stuff we saw in the Tekken Talk, I see more of these examples of good character design and good stance design. One of these reasons is from Reina. Reina is one of the very few characters in Tekken 8 that actually has good stance design. The reason why is because if she does say forward 4-2 in the Sentai, she has to take a risk there to do that, obviously, being that she can be sidestepped, right? Now, that's not nearly as big of a risk as some other things, but it is a risk. The other thing, if she doesn't go in the stance after forward 4-2, she's -9. So she goes into Sentai after it because of that. If she doesn't, the opponent doesn't necessarily get a punish, but they can take their turn. But the thing is that Sentai isn't a powerful enough stance that the opponent has to respond to. The defender doesn't have to just go, oh, it's 50-50 mix-up time, because the low is launch punishable and it doesn't do a whole lot of damage for what it is. You only go into Sentai at +2, which means jabs will trade with the 3 and down jabs will be everything except for the 1+2. The 1+2 can be sidestepped, you can armor through a lot of the moves because of the frames, and because of that, the defender has a lot of options and gets a lot of reward out of proper defense and proper reads than Reina, the attacker. And it also means if the defender has the right read on what move Reina is going to do, then they get a big reward out of that. Whereas Reina, if she chooses to do something, she is always taking a risk doing it. But if she does the right thing, then she gets reward. And if she is trying to attack someone who's not doing anything, then she can influence plus frames with the low, with the 4 or the 1+2, and then she can get reward out of that as well. Is it 1+2 or is it 3+4? I don't even remember at this point. No, it's 3+4. I said 1+2. I'm good. Anyway, you get the point. So that is more of an example of good stance design. And that's one of the things that makes Reina unique is her ability to utilize all of these different stances she has. She has Sentai and Heaven's Wrath, of course, both of which have risk to them, and both of which aren't just like a brain-dead 50-50. But also, she has all of those other stances as well, like down 1+4, I think the one where she crouches low, she has the one where she does the somersault, she has the one where she backs up and kind of does this, and then has the 4 for the heat engager, and they're giving you the ability to cancel these stances into other stances. And the healthy part about this and what makes this interesting is that, one, it's something unique that Reina can do. There aren't other characters in the game that can go like stance and the stance and the stance and the stance. That's something that only really Reina can do. And giving her more options out of that is really good for her. It adds to the player expression and creativity they can use with Reina, so that's good. The other thing is, because these stances are already well designed, you don't really have to change so much about the moves that are in those stances to balance it, right? You can take the stances as they are, now add all these elements to it, and it will be completely fine. But the other part is that this promotes interaction, because while Reina can do all of these stance cancels, again, the mix-up isn't so powerful that the opponent necessarily has to respond to it. But if they choose to, then they can get big reward out of it. So that's what gives the defender the incentive to interact with it. It's not that they have to because the mix-up is really big. It's because of the reward that they get out of like interrupting one of the cancels and then being able to launch it. And so that is what's going to give Reina more options out of the stance and the stance cancels. And so this promotes a healthy interaction between the two players and the two characters that you don't see with a lot of characters and stances in Tekken 8. And so I think a lot of people see this thing with Reina and they just say, oh, you can just do more stances and more mix-up bullshit. But that's not necessarily the case. And I think that might be a little bit more obvious now, because now you have that perspective on what good stance design looks like. So these are some examples between good stance design and bad stance design. Ultimately, the problem with Tekken is there is a lack of interaction between the attacker and the defender. Based on what I've seen from the Tekken Talk, from stuff in Season 2, and even looking at Ana, who's a completely not a topic we don't have a lot of time for, but when we look at the unique mechanics we're seeing, when we look at how these stances work and how these aspects work, that's what makes me hopeful going into Season 2, that there's going to be a little bit more nuance and there's going to be better game design with the characters and the stances than we see in Season 1. I think a big reason why we see so many people complaining about whether they're just, people that are out online talking about this, or even from pro players, is that a lot of these people don't play other fighting games, especially 3D fighting games. How many pro Tekken players can you think of that also play Soul Calibur or Virtua Fighter? Not many, if at all. You have some people like Arsenal and Ash that might play KOF, but KOF is in a completely different realm than Tekken. And so I think that because Tekken players don't have this perspective on and like being able to visually see what the difference is between a good stance and good game design and what's a bad stance and bad game design, that's what's created a lot of this discourse. We can't look at this through a wide lens. We can't analyze things very well because we just don't know what good design looks like and what bad design looks like. And I hope that through this video, I have shown you what the difference is between good game design and bad game design, and why maybe Season 2 isn't gonna be all doom and gloom. Anyway, that's everything I have for you. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye!